Okay, good morning. In the previous session, we discussed about the VMware. What is a VMware? And then what are the components of VMware? How can you install the VMware? That is a simple information. Now we are going to know about the Microsoft Hyper-V. Here, what is the Microsoft Hyper-V? The Microsoft Hyper-V is a hypervisor for the Windows Server. Here, what is a hypervisor? Hypervisor is a connectivity or interface or connectivity between your hardware as well as the operating system. Hardware as well as the operating system. That means in the virtualization, hypervisor plays an important role for communicating physical server and virtual machines. Here, this Microsoft or MS Hyper-V or simply call it as a Hyper-V allows administrator to create a virtual environment and it creates a virtual mission effectively manage them. That means the Hyper-V, that means if you have in the Windows 10, Windows 10 having also, for example, my system is a Windows 10 system. Here also Hyper-V is there for creating the virtual operating systems or virtual mission. And then another important point in this case here is it allows a single physical CPU to run multiple operating system. Yeah, that means isolated from a one another. For this purpose he created, that means the Microsoft introduced this hypervisor concept. It is a commutator for the VMware. The first VMware launched for the virtual mission. First launched the VMware. After that, the the commutator, the Microsoft Hyper-V is a virtual one of the hypervisor for VMware software. And then it is introduced in the year 2008. That means in 2008 Windows Server. Hyper-V is a hypervisor based virtualization technology. That means here in this case you are using the hypervisor. It is a processor specific virtualization platform, allows a multiple isolated operating system to share a single hardware platform. What is the main intention of using this hypervisor? Here is the hypervisor uses a single hardware platform and creates a n number of virtual machines. That is a main important point in the creation of hypervisor. Here hypervisor Hyper-V supports a, that means simply call it as a hypervisor also. Simply it supports a isolation in terms of partition. What is the information here? Here in this case here, this Hyper-V consists of two different partitions. So one partition is a parent partition, other partition is a child partition. Like that, it divides the entire isolation in terms of partition. Here, what is a partition in this case? Partition is a logical unit of isolation supported by the hypervisor in which operating system execute. Here, the partition, how can you represent the partition here? The partition is a logical unit of isolation. It is a unit of isolation supported by the hypervisor in which the operating system can execute. The Microsoft hypervisor must have at least one parent, or you simply call it as a root node, or simply call it as a root partition here. And then other one is a child partition running Windows. Here these are all different components of hypervisor. And then Hyper-V was first released Windows Server 2008 and has available without additional charges since 2000 server, since Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8. That means it's a standalone. Windows Hyper-V server is a free, but it is a free. Even though it is free, you are taking the only command line interface only. That means it is provides a free command, not a like that VMware. VMware provides a GUI as well as the command line interface, but here it provides only command line interface free. And then this consists of Windows Server 2008 and core and Hyper-V role, and the other Windows Server 2008 roles are disabled, and there are limited Windows services are there. Hyper-V Server 2008 is limited to command line interface. Already we discussed that concept. Used to configure the host operating system, physical hardware and software. A menu-driven CI command line interface. Here CLI in the sense command line interface and some freely downloadable script files configuration. And then in addition, the hypervisor, Hyper-V or MS hypervisor supports a remote access via remote desktop connection. Here in this case, the host operating system as well as the that means the administrator and configuration of host operating system as well as the guest of virtual machine is done over the network using some of the components are there using either Microsoft Management Console on the Windows computer or System Central Virtual Machine Manager. This allows much easier point and click configuration and monitoring of Hyper-V server. This is a very important task on the monitoring technologies. Here coming to the latest version from the September 2009 onwards. From September 2009 onwards, Hyper-V server 2008 R2, edition of Windows Server 2008. That means was made available in a from the year 2009. Here, what are the extra features for this Hyper-V Server 2008 R3? It includes a Windows PowerShell V2 for great CLI in the sense uh, CLI control. The CLI means it is a command line interface. The command line interface control. And then remote access to the Hyper-V server requires a CLI configuration of network interfaces and Windows firewall. Here it is also that means it supports all Windows operating system, some of the operating system, but Windows Vista PC to administrator Hyper-V server R2 is not fully supported. Windows Vista not supported. Here coming to the architecture of MS Hyper-V. This architecture consists of two different components are there. One is a parent partition, other one is a child partition. Here the bottom indicates the hardware component. There is a on top of the hardware component you have a hypervisor is there. The hypervisor is a connectivity between a operating system as well as the virtual machine operating system as well as the hardware in a system. And then you have a VM buses are there, and then VM the parent partition consists of VMI provider, virtual machine management service, virtual machine worker processes, and then Windows kernel, device drivers, and then virtualization service provider. Here, if it comes to the child partition, the child partition consists of application, virtualization service consumer, and then Windows kernel, VM buses. In both the parent partition as well as the child partition consists of VM buses. That means here it's divided into ring 1, ring 0, ring 3. The ring 3 you call it as a user mode, ring 0 you call it as a kernel mode, and then you have a ring 1 is there. This is a architecture. Coming to the in this architecture you have a child partition is there. The right side you indicates the child partition. What is the child partition here? Here this is a partition that hosts the guest operating system. Here in the child partition the right hand side that hosts the guest operating system. Guest operating system in the sense for example I am using the Windows operating system, Windows 10 operating system. This particular Windows 10 operating system is a host operating system. I'm going to installing the on top of this operating system. I'm going to installing a Linux operating system. Let us assume here in this case Linux operating system is a virtual operating system or guest operating system. Here the guest that means the partition that hosts the guest operating system. Only the purpose here for hosting the guest operating system you are using a child partition. All access to physical memory and devices by child partition is provided via virtual machine bus. Virtual machine bus or hypervisor. Here this is called here the virtual VM bus. VMBus or virtual mission bus. Here, how can you represent this here? Any access to the physical memory and devices by child partition. Here, why? Because you are hosting the guest operating system only. But how can you access the physical memory? You can access the physical memory and the devices by child partition provided via virtual mission bus. With the help of virtual mission only, the child partition access the data. And then another important component here is a hypercall. Here, what is a hypercall? Hypercall is an interface for communication with the hypervisor. In order to communication with the hypervisor, you are using the hypercall. Hypercall here, it is an interface. Hypercall interface accommodates access to the optimizations provided by the hypervisor. And then another important component, hypervisor. If you see the diagram here, the bottom hardware is there. On top of the hardware, you have a hypervisor is there, ring one. Here, what is a hypervisor? A hypervisor is a layer of software that sits between a hardware and one or more operating system. On the top of the hypervisor, you are having the one or more operating system. Here it is a simply layer here. The primary job is what is the primary job of hypervisor here? To provide a isolation execution environment. Here to provide the isolation execution environment, that is called here partitions. That is a simply represented as a partition. The hypervisor controls and access to the hardware, underlying hardware. That means it's having the control, the main control and access. That is a the hypervisor component in a MS Hyper-V architecture. Coming to the VMBus. Here, what is a VMBus here? VMBus, and what is a VMBus? It is a channel-based communication mechanism. VMBus is a channel-based communication mechanism that's existed, that reside in a kernel mode, the ring 0. Here, what is the main purpose of this one? Used for inter-partition communication and device enumeration on the system with multiple active virtualized partitions. Here, what is the main purpose of this one? For inter-partition communication. Here, device enumeration on a system. For this purpose, you are using the VM bus. Here, coming to the VMMS. VMMS means Virtual Mission Management Service. Where it is Virtual Mission Management Service. Yeah, yeah, here is there. Here in the party, in the parent partition, on top of on bottom of the VM provider, there is a virtual mission management service is there. Here, what is the purpose of virtual mission management service here? Responsible for managing the state of all virtual mission in a child partition. Here in the diagram here, the right hand side indicates the child partition. What is the specialty of this child virtual partition here? Responsible for managing the state of all virtual machines in a child partition. From the child partition, a number of virtual machines are there. Here, for managing all virtual machine, how can you manage? By using this virtual mission management service. And then VMWP, virtual mission worker process. Virtual mission worker process here is there. Here, that means on the bottom of virtual mission management service, there is a virtual mission worker process. Here, what is the specialty of this worker process here? User-made component of virtualization stack. It is a user-made component of virtualization stack. And then another important one is the virtualization service client. Here, you will identify the virtualization service client. Where it is, yeah, this is a virtualization service client. What is the specialty here? The synthetic device instance that reside in a child partition. It is a some information that reside in a child partition. And then this virtual service client hardware, that means utilizes the hardware resources that are provided by the virtualization service provider. Where it is virtualization service provider, here is there. On top of the if it comes to the parent partition, the parent partition on the top position is called the VMI provider, virtual virtual service provider in the parent partition. Next one, VSP, virtual service provider. What is the main specialty of VSP? The VSP existed in a parent partition. Here it is existed in a parent partition and provides a synthetic device support to child partition. Is it clear? That means it is existed in a parent partition and it provides a support to the child partition over the VM bus. Here by using VM bus, it provides a some synthetic device support. Another important one is that is these are all different components of Hyper-V architecture. The working principle here you are going to know about the working principle of hypervisor. Hyper-V implements a isolation of virtual machine in terms of partition. I think you discussed that concept here. Here the Hyper-V always implements the isolation of virtual machine in terms of partition. Here you have some idea that we soon discuss that concept. Logical unit of isolation supported by the hypervisor in which each guest operating system execute. That is called here partition. There must at least one parent partition in hypervisor instance and running a supported version of Windows Server 2008 later. That means this Hyper-V supports a 2000 Windows Server 2008 after. And then here comes to in the virtualization software runs in a, that means where you are running the virtualization software here, the virtualization software runs in a parent partition and has direct access to the hardware devices. Here the software here in the parent partition only you are running the software in a parent partition. The parent partition creates a child partitions. Here, what is the main specialty here? Parent partition creates a child partition which hosts the guest OS. Here, the child partition always maintains a guest operating system. The parent partition creates a child partition using Hypercall API. Already discussed that Hypercall API. Here, what is the Hypercall API? The always here in this case, the parent partition maintains the hardware devices, and then the parent partition creates a child partition, and then how can you create the child partition here? Here you will the parent partition creates a child partition by using Hypercall API. What is an Hypercall API here? Which is a application programming interface here exposed by the Hyper-V. That means application program interface that is supported by the Microsoft Hyper-V. Here coming to the child partition. The child partition does not have access to the physical processes. Does not have access to the physical processor, nor and does not handle its real interrupts. Here it cannot access to the physical processes, the child process, and it cannot handle its real interrupts. That is a child process. Instead, what is the specialty of child process here? The child process have the virtual view of processors and guest the virtual address. Depending on virtual machine configuration, Hyper-V may expose only subset of processors to each partition. That is a thing of Hyper-V architecture. Here, if it comes to the Hyper-V, here in this case, what are the work of Hyper-V? Hypervisor handles the interrupts to the processor. Whatever may be the interrupts existed, that interrupt. So that means what is a interrupt? Interrupt is a which will stops the execution of the program. Here anywhere that means you are when you are writing the any program here you are getting some interrupt. If you comes to the 8085, 8086 microprocessor programming, you are having some different interrupts are there. The main aim of interrupt here is to stop the execution, which will stop the execution. Here Here in this case, hypervisor always handles the interrupts to the processor and redirect them to the respective partition by using a logical synthetic interrupt controller. By using that means the hypervisor having the logic interrupt controller. That means it will use the logic interrupt controller to handle the interrupt. The child partition do not have direct access to the hardware. Already discussed that one. And then the Hyper-V architecture, any request to the virtual device is redirected via VMBus to device in the parent partition, which will manage the request. VMBus is a logical channel which enables the inter-partition communication. Here, that is a main aim, the work of VMBus in a Hyper-V, MS Hyper-V. And then response, the response is redirected via VMBus. And then if device in the parent partition are virtual devices, if that means if the devices in the parent partition are virtual devices, it will be redirected further until it reaches the parent partition where it will gain the access to the physical devices. And then in this case, parent partition, that means parent partition run virtualization service provider. The parent partition have the virtualization service provider. That means it will transfer parent virtualization service provider which connect to the VM bus. Here VMI provider connect to the bottom VM bus and handles the device access request from the child partitions. Here you have a device access request is there. Here always access the device access request. The parent partition runs the VSP here which connect to the VM bus and then handles the access request from the child partition. The child partition virtual device, that means virtual devices run a virtualization service client. That means virtualization service client. Here you will identify the virtualization service client, that's called it as a virtualization service consumer. Here which redirect the request to the VSP in a parent partition via VM bus. This entire process transferring to the guest operating system. That is important in a MS Hyper-V architecture. And then the virtual devices can also take the advantages of Windows Server virtualization feature. That means that is called as a WSV, Windows Server virtualization feature, named enlightened IO for the storage, the networking and graphic. That means for the storage, networking. That means it's having the enlightened IO, storage, networking, and graphic systems, among the others. Here, this IO is specialized virtualization. Here, in this case, we are using the specialized virtualization, and then this makes the communication more efficient, but requires guest operating systems to support this enlightened IO. And then coming to the some of the advantages here having. Here Hyper-V not architecture, Hyper-V consists of it cheaper than the VMware vSphere. Right? It's having the dynamic memory management and then no downtime for the maintenance. Here for that means it is a very cheaper. In the VMware you discussed about the concept here. Here the MS Hyper-V is a commutator for the VMware. Here it is a dynamic memory management, no downtime for the maintenance. Here it's having the simple live migration. One physical, that means it's having a simple live migration is there. The simple live migration in the sense here converting one physical that means system to the migration, and then backup is very easy and active directory offer, and then it provides some security like that. It's having the some advantages are there, and then some of the disadvantages with the MS Hyper-V architecture. What are the disadvantages in this case? It's have a more challenging host interaction. poor support for the Linux operating system. Here it supports the MS Hyper-V supports only in the Windows operating system, but poor support for the Linux operating system. All virtual machines needs to be offline for the security updates, and then reboot the, and then this having the some interfaces existed. Because of these reasons, it's having some, these are all different disadvantages for the MS hypervisor. Here if we compare to the two MSV, that means VMware and Hyper-V, how can you comparing this one here? Here if you comes to the Hyper-V, having the more scalability, good performance, and then security, and then flexible infrastructure, high availability, resilience, 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 having the resilience capabilities. That means resilience in the sense resilience, safety, and then some of the, these are all some attributes, parameter for the system. And then coming to the VMware vSphere is a more expensive. Here, Hyper-V is a cost is very less, but here more expensive. IT developers and operators, the price by claiming that Hyper-V is actually behind the vSphere in the very every stage of development. That means it is using vSphere as a guide for which way they should grow. And that is a simple comparison is there. It assumes VMware vSphere comes out on the top. Why? Because even though it is a costlier, but work is somewhat good in the in this virtualization game. But you must not forget the hypervisor is a very cheaper. That is a thing. Even that is a thing. And then the installation process here, how can you installing the hypervisor software? And then you may install the hypervisor software, and then after installing the hypervisor software, you may do some operation. That means you may create a virtual machines on a hypervisor software. Here for installing the hypervisor software, you have to do something. What are the information here? Enable the hypervisor role through by using settings here. How can you enable this information? Right click on the Windows button. If you identify the, that means it supports a Windows 10. Right click on the Windows button and select the app features and select the programming and okay, come to the this one. Right click on the Windows. Here if you comes to the Windows here, you have to right click here. If you right click here, you will identify the app and app features. Here app features, what are the app features here? Here see here, here have the some settings. It comes to the app features. Under the app features, select the app features, select the app features. Under this, select the program and features. Okay, 1 minute.